it's a real pleasure to welcome back Professor Bill Rasch, because Bill is a regular visitor to CSD. In fact, we were trying to find out exactly how many. We certainly thought in even maybe the fifth time that he's visiting us, so it's already kind of part of the family, and it's always very nice to have him back. Bill Rasch is professor in two departments in University of Indiana, because he teaches half-time in German studies and the other part in the international studies. He is also well known here because of a book which has been published by Birkbeck University Press, which is called Sovereignty and Its Discontent, and that many students, many people have been using. It's on several reading lists here. And at the moment, he is writing a book on Schmidt for the collection of, is it called Key
Contemporary
Thinkers for Political Press. And today he's going to give us a talk on the Kantian intellectual.
I will not be talking about Schmidt, so you will be relieved, I'm sure, I hope. I'll explain a little bit of the situation. This comes from a longer essay, which still was not long enough because of word constraints. It's part of this impact of idealism of a series of volumes that will come out with Cambridge University Press, I think the end of this year, supposedly. And I was asked to write on, for the volume on political thought, I was asked to write on public opinion or public sphere. And I kept, this is not my favorite topic, I couldn't figure out what to do, and it slid into actually talking about Kant and the notion of the intellectual. So therefore it does bring in his notion of the public, obviously, in the public sphere. And since it's the impact, I give some discussion of the 20th century, of a couple of 20th century figures. I have to cut some parts out, so some of the discussion of Kant's notion of history, I'll just summarize. And also there's a section on Habermas, which I will not read, but I'll talk about two other 20th century figures. Habermas is more or less the example of a Kantian intellectual, and then there's two figures who are critical of that. I start with a quote from Tony Judt, and it's from his final book, his last book. Democracies corrode quite fast. They corrode because most people don't care very much about them. The difficulty of sustaining voluntary interest in the business of choosing the people who will rule over you is well attested. And the reason why we need intellectuals, as well as all the good journalists we can find, is to fill the space that grows between the two parts of democracy, the governed and the governors. Okay, now I start. Tony Judt's vision of democracy is justifiably bleak, not only because he was dying when he composed these words, but also because, despite its apparent near-universal victory, democracy seems to be dying as well. Referring to the business of choosing the people who will rule over you and identifying the two parts of democracy as the governed and the governors certainly falls far short of the democratic ideal. Are not the ruled also the rulers the ruled, temporarily elevated? Admittedly, direct democracy in which all the people are assembled to make collective decisions has become impossible for all but the smallest of communities. The cynic might say, for all but the solitary individual. But even within representative democracy, are not the representatives said to be of the people, carrying with them the trust and goodwill of the majority? What then is the space that grows between the people and the people's representatives? Some have pointed to the routinized business of politics as a profession, creating the politician who not only or at all lives for politics as a calling, but from politics as a job like any other. It's obviously a reference to Weber. Others have emphasized political parties and the oligarchic machinery that eventually transformed them. That's Roberto Michels. So I'm going back to the early 20th century for these characterizations. Both claims could easily be seen as the necessary result of the vast complexity of modern society, a complexity that precludes overview and transparency and therefore calls for blind trust in expert knowledge. There I'm referring to Luhmann. These and other similar symptoms point to the fundamental structural divide that inheres in modern liberal democracy, namely the welcome severance of the private from the public sphere. no longer participating actively in the public duty of collective decision-making, the people dissolve into people, a collection of individuals pursuing private interests. What surprises at first glance is the claim that intellectuals and journalists have it as their vocation to fill this space between. More famous and surely more pleasing, more flattering is the view that the link between the private individual and those who govern should be the voice of the masses themselves. The attempt to formulate a modern deliberative democracy in which reason as a universal medium and cosmopolitan force will govern the governors finds in the reception and elaboration of Kant its main tool. Indeed, Kant has become the universally celebrated champion of the public use of reason. Jürgen Habermas and others exhibit as evidence passages from a wide array of Kant's texts from 1780 on, including all three critiques and a fair sampling of his essays. Here one sees Kant argue for a public sphere in which all questions may be deliberated in a dispassionately rational manner. Ideally, that is projected into a hypothetical future that may never come about, open public discussion will eventually find its most fitting home in a pacified confederation of European republics. Peace will have become the norm, and reason, because of its unfettered public use, will be continuously self-perfecting. That's the view, that's the image. Kant's notion of the intellectual, though, is bound up in the Enlightenment doctrine of human perfectibility and the philosophy of history that enables the counterfactual faith in that doctrine. It is, therefore, the cunning of history that is the main concern of this paper. The axe I grind has the following edge. When one turns mankind as a species into a destiny or a never-ending project, one deliberately or accidentally denigrates and demeans the historically situated human individual, who must always be found deficient. Even though one cannot know concretely what history has in store for humanity, belief in perfectibility requires that one acts as if humankind were moving along a progressive course. If that course of history is in turn supposed to be accelerated by deliberate human actions, if we are in some way said to be able to discern a meaning in Cleo's whisperings, making progress a cultural or design and not merely a natural or evolutionary artifact, then the individual can be credited with abetting or held accountable for retarding the species' advancement. Those who claim greater vision than the masses thus see themselves entrusted with the task of coaxing along or, if necessary, disciplining the lesser abled. The dark shadow that this enlightened view casts, however, is the possibility that the very desire to advance the course of history, in fact, causes the opposite, history's greatest depredations. Not an uncommon thesis, I don't believe, but nonetheless one worth repeating. So, I start with a quote now from Kant. Is the human race as a whole to be loved, or is it an object such that one must regard it with vexation, for which one indeed wishes everything good, so as not to become misanthropic, but of which one must never expect this, so that one must avert one's eyes from it? It's a convoluted sentence. I'll lay this out a bit. Is this not a strange question? First, who poses it? The simple answer is Immanuel Kant. Since we assume Kant to have been a human being, this initial answer does not get us very far, for the real question is, what does it mean for an individual human being to profess love or distaste for the race, the Geschlecht, to which he or she belongs? Is love for the human race a type of self-love and contempt a form of self-hatred? This seems not to be the case, because the we, apparently Kant speaks for more than himself, clearly think of themselves as able to root for the human team or turn their backs on them with a measure of detachment, even studied indifference. Moved by misery, yet also capable of utter complacency, we are apparently of the Geschlecht, of the race, and yet above or outside it as well, situated so as to view it as a whole. Furthermore, viewing it as a whole would appear to involve the necessary self-exemption, for the observer distances herself from the action of those who are subject to observation. There are still more questions to be asked. Does a spectator really become a misanthrope when the team she would like to cheer for loses? Does love come only with the eventual prospect of victory, perfection? And what are humanity's efforts anyway? If individual humans compete nastily with each other, how do we arrive at the view that there is some collective purpose to their actions? That question, Kant tells us, can be answered only when we answered this one. Quote, are there in human nature predispositions from which one can gather that the race will always progress toward what is better, and that the evil of present and past times will disappear in the good of future times? End quote. Judging the success or failure of humanity's efforts is postponed, measured by historical standards, by the knowledge or well-grounded assumption that humanity as a whole has the ability to perfect itself, even if now and here singular human acts are vile and brutish. For in that case, Kant goes on to say, we could still love the race. In other words, if we believe that it's perfectible, we could still love the race, at least in its constant approach to the good. If, however, we can discern no such inclination toward the good in the human animal, we should have to hate or despise it. Kant is speaking again. We should have to hate or despise it, whatever might be said to the contrary by the affectations of universal philanthropy, which would then be, at most, only a love of benevolence, not of delight. This seems a harsh judgment. Why should this mysterious we despise human beings for their imperfections in the face of our lack of sure knowledge of or projected hopes for the future? But Kant is adamant, quote, for however one may try to exact love from oneself, one cannot avoid hating what is and remains evil, especially in deliberate mutual violation of the most sacred human rights, not exactly so as to inflict troubles upon him, but still so as to have as little as possible to do with him. The choice, end quote, the choice to be made is stark and unremitting. Either the human race can make use of a capacity to improve its status morally, or there is nothing left for us to do but thoroughly and completely despise the loathsome, slithering individual creatures that comprise it. The passage quoted above opens the third section of Kant's famous essay on the relationship between theory and practice. In essence, it asserts the following. Should one wish to devise a practical, that is a moral, legal, political, philosophy of human communal life, one must presuppose a teleological philosophy of universal history, or else refuse to be complicit in the deeds humans inflict on fellow humans. Without the ideal of human perfectibility, it asserts, the human being is not worth bothering with. Kant drives this home by way of contrast. Section 3 of the essay was aimed at remarks about human nature made by Moses Mendelssohn. The spectacle of the human animal going about its daily round throughout the course of history, Mendelssohn wrote, reveals, quote, roughly the same level of morality, the same measure of religion and irreligion, of virtue and vice, of happiness and misery, end quote. Incremental progress is followed invariably by setback. When the alternating peaks and valleys are averaged out, we are left with the flatline horizon as seen from a desert. For the moral philosopher, so Kant believes, such a view is intolerable. If the actors in this farce, Possenspiel is Kant's word, never tire of their roles as alternating victors and victims, it is because they are fools, also Kant's term, Narren. But the philosophical spectator cannot allow himself to believe that such a world can be reconciled with the morality of a wise creator, and must therefore be allowed to assume that the human race is, quote, progressing toward what is better with respect to the moral ends of its existence. I was peppering little mini quotes from Kant in there. So the morality of a wise creator is actually something that Kant says. Kant defends this assumption, which as his language indicates is all it can be, a necessary assumption, an idea in the Kantian sense of idea, not an object of knowledge, by denying that the burden of proof lies with him. Rather, it is the negative that must be proven. I always love this argumentation. That is, one need not prove that human existence has a purpose. One assumes it and challenges the skeptic to prove otherwise. So it's always that way. I mean, it always gets me that the only way to describe that one does. The only way to describe that one is not a Christian or not a Jew, or is to say I'm a non-believer. You don't get to describe yourself positively. It's always in the negative. They occupy the territory, and we are just not part of the territory. I'm not part of the territory. I don't mean to include anyone in the room. So that's the same argument that Kant uses here about moral progress. Nevertheless, for those whom this version of Pascal's wager does not convince, Kant adduces evidence that, quote, the human race as a whole has actually made considerable moral progress, based on the fact that its judgment about what one is as compared with what one ought to be, hence our self-reproach, becomes all the more severe the more levels of morality we have already climbed during the whole of the course of the world we have become acquainted with, end quote. Our increased dissatisfaction with the ways of the world gives negative proof that we have indeed progressed to such a degree that we now at least may triumph over complacency. We humans, of the better sort at least, torture ourselves because we know we have become superior to what we were in the past, yet are also convinced that we could be so much better in the future than we are now. And this is a part I'm going to skip, but I just want to mention a couple of things. I go into an analysis of his essay on history in a cosmopolitan sense, world history in a cosmopolitan sense. There's just 2 points. There's these two, he has a series of propositions, and the last two propositions I wish to just quote. Proposition, I think it's 7 and 8, or 8 and 9, but anyway, second to the last proposition. One can regard the history of the human species in the large as the completion of a hidden plan of nature to bring about an inwardly, and to this end also an externally perfect state constitution as the only condition in which it can fully develop all its predispositions in humanity. What he's talking about there is the famous unsocial social ability, that we're being pushed through our negative traits, our violence to each other. We're pushed towards eventual pacification because we're going to eventually get so disgusted with killing each other. Our unsociability will lead to sociability. So that's a kind of natural, and there's some Kantian scholars who believe that he's mostly a natural, there's a natural evolutionary process. The very next proposition says the following: a philosophical attempt to work out universal world history according to a plan of nature that aims at the perfect civil union of the human species must be regarded as possible, and even as furthering this aim of nature. So the can be regarded becomes must be regarded. And not only is that it's possible that nature is driving it this way, but if we develop a philosophical plan, which elsewhere he calls a novel, he says it may sound like I'm writing a novel to you, and yes, it is sort of a novel. This philosophical plan can actually further the aim of nature. It aids and abets nature in its progress, and that's how you can see how the human being then becomes an agent in this, even if it's by writing a novel, so to speak, of progress. Okay. Kant's account, whether we think progress to be propelled primarily by nature or freedom, is both tolerable and pleasing because counterfactual. It does not purport to describe the way things are or even the way things necessarily will be, but the way things could be if certain rules of thought were properly ascertained and correctly practiced, at first by the few and then adopted by the many. In other words, the unfinished, perhaps never-ending, but nevertheless necessary Enlightenment project of modernity gives us something to hope for. Though initiated by the cunning of nature, the unsocial sociability, further progress can be accomplished only with the complicity of human reason. Yes, such accounts please us, but they may also carry with them a heavy, if often unacknowledged, burden. If nature is purposive and history has a providential meaning and ultimate purpose, and if the human being has a role through the free exercise of reason in the fulfillment of that purpose, then failure or setback must be due to a moral failure for which the human should be held accountable. Kant is therefore explicitly concerned about the causes for human performance anxieties. The sorrow that the thoughtless human may feel when witnessing the seemingly chaotic and purposeless events of history may become a moral corruption, he warns. Therefore, Kant urges us to be, quote, content with providence and not blame fate for our toils and troubles, so that we not lose sight of our own responsibility, which perhaps might be the sole cause of all these ills, and avoid the remedy against them, which consists in self-improvement, end quote. Kant appears here to be dispensing pastoral care, but behind the reassurances and promise of meaning lies a distinct threat. Would failure to think the coming good impede its arrival? If so, can one who fails to write or affirm such a narrative live with the guilt? More importantly, should others tolerate such a misprison? For providence to fulfill its mission, mandatory human self-correction is required, since the majority, as we will see, who are lazy, foolish, or simply rendered incompetent by inertia, suffer from a self-incurred intellectual minority, Unmündigkeit. The project of modernity needs supervision. Here then, inserting themselves between the governed and the governors, enter the intellectuals, those charged with correcting the masters when their measures prevent free intellectual inquiry, and educating the mastered on how to think for themselves so that the human race may eventually cross, or at least like the runner who forever travels half the remaining distance, infinitely approach its historical finish line. Okay. Kant's finely structured answer to the question of enlightenment is justly praised for its advocacy of the public use of reason. I'm repeating myself a bit. No matter the almost Byzantine qualifications of what counts as the public and who has access to it. Whatever constrictions Kant felt necessary to impose because of his own political beliefs and the political situation of his time and place, later commenters feel that Kant's public is infinitely expandable, fit to include any and all who agree to abide by clearly defined rules. My interest here is not the notion of public reason per se, but the role of the intellectual, the Gelehrte, or later the philosopher, in supervising the use of public reason. In this way, we will return to the question I asked at the end of the previous section and to the place assigned intellectuals by Tony Judt, namely between the ruled and the rulers. The answers to all these questions depend in part on how one chooses to narrate history. Perhaps the most famous opening line in modern philosophy is Kant's answer to the question, what is enlightenment? And that answer is, enlightenment is the human being's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Selbstverschuldeten Unmündigkeit. Some people translate immaturity in minority, making it a legal term. Self-incurred lack of majority, lack of legal majority. Not surprisingly, the German original is more powerful. The blame, the guilt, the debt, all those words are found in the root of Schuld. To be paid for one's legal and moral minority is one's own. Why? Because far too many humans are too lazy, too cowardly to use their rational capacities to think for themselves. Even, quote, after nature has long since emancipated them from other people's direction, end quote, this great proportion of humanity submits only too willingly to the authority of self-appointed guardians, preachers, teachers, bureaucrats, well-meaning know-it-alls. How is one to regard this band of lazy and cowardly ne'er-do-wells? With sarcasm. Quote, it is so comfortable to be a minor, or it is so comfortable to be immature. And how should one respond? With a challenge. Sapere aude, have courage to make use of your own understanding, is thus the motto of enlightenment, end quote. In short, Kant's answer to the famous question opens with a swift kick in the pants and unmistakable marching orders. In his January 1983 lecture on Kant's text, Michel Foucault discusses the opening passage in ways that warrant further elaboration. That our tutelage is self-incurred, he notes, is due to human error. A flaw, a shortcoming, or a form of will, those are Foucault's terms, end quote, deflects us from our task, makes us incapable of thinking for ourselves. Our culpability is not some sort of natural powerlessness, for it is assumed that we are able to overcome it and are urged resolutely to do so. Kant's providential narrative of history, in other words, is neither a simple Christian homily about imperfection, nor a customary Enlightenment tale of the stages of human development from infancy to full maturation. Rather, we have always had the potential to act autonomously. Failure is a failure of will, thus self-incurred. Zeroing in on Kant's motto, Foucault asserts, The Wahlspruch, the word that gets translated as motto, the Wahlspruch is actually a maxim, precept, or order given to others and to oneself. But at the same time, and this is what makes the precept of the Wahlspruch a motto, a blazon, it is something by which one identifies oneself and enables one to distinguish oneself from others. The use of a maxim as a precept is therefore at once an order and a distinctive mark. End quote. It is unclear just what distinction Foucault has in mind, but surely one possibility is to assume that what distinguishes the we from the greater proportion of humanity is the same as the one that separated the reflective spectator above from the foolish actors in life's petty dramas. The narrative that offers the reader a larger trajectory of human history provided by a providential nature is not just a novel one may choose to read or not, it is an obligatory assignment, though far too many lack the courage, apparently, and energy to carry it out. How then to encourage them? Kant has no answer. Rather, he focuses on how to carve out a public space for the educated and literate few to occupy. We know the model: argue, but obey. Within the Prussian state governed by the monarchy, everyone obeys, of course, but the directive here is meant for the educated elite, especially those who are functionaries of the state. While performing their civic duties, servants of the state, professors, teachers, lawyers, military officers, preachers, tax collectors, civil servants of all stripes, remain within state and church-sanctioned limits, preaching dogma, giving orders, teaching nothing that would subvert the prescribed divine or secular order. On their own, however, and as scholars, they may, and that's Gelehrte, they may enter the literary public sphere to debate the truth of the various disciplinary and professional dogmas, from religion to military strategy and taxation policy. Nothing is said here about how such scholarly debate could directly provoke the ill or barely literate to begin to think for themselves. Yes, there could be a precocious country lad or lass who hungrily learns to devour learned journals and thereby raises him or herself to the rank of mature autonomy, and Fichte comes to mind. But this is no program of emancipation. Rather, Kant introduces here a division of labor by segregating two functions of the intellectual: a specialized private, meaning civic, and general public, meaning exempt from narrow civic duty, activity. This division of labor is a self-division. All functionaries may wish to publish as public scholars, as well as serve king and country. The intellectual is both civil servant and potential independent scholar. With Kant's famed public-private distinction, we have one model answering to the demand that intellectuals insert themselves between the rulers and the ruled. On the one hand, intellectuals, as functionaries, act as the guardians of those who have not accepted the sapere aude challenge, preaching and teaching the state's verities to the lazy and cowardly multitude, the ruled. Having served their civic duty in exemplary fashion, those who have learned to think for themselves may then turn to their duty as autonomous, reasoning beings and publish their independently arrived at views in the public sphere of learned readers. In so doing, they, in effect, preach and teach reason's truth to their own functionary selves, and more importantly, to those who rule, ultimately the king, Frederick II. The intellectual as functionary serves the rulers in their rule over the ruled, while the same intellectual, now as free and independent scholar, may serve the interests of the ruled in articulating well-reasoned and reasonable forms of rule to the ruler. This picture of the Janus-faced intellectual, however, becomes greatly complicated a decade later, as revealed in Kant's compilations of essays published under the title The Conflict of the Faculties. So I move there. Whereas in What is Enlightenment, the intellectual was bifurcated into the public pedagogue and the independent scholar, in Conflict we have a trifurcation: functionary, disciplinary scholar, and as final authority, the philosopher. Kant begins with the familiar division between scholars and the functionaries are now referred to as businessmen, Geschäftsleute, or technicians of learning, Werkkundige der Gelehrsamkeit. These technicians are literally tools, he uses the term Werkzeuge, and I'm quoting now, tools of the government, clergymen, magistrates, and physicians, and thus are not free to make public use of their learning as they see fit, I'm still quoting, but are subject to the censorship of the faculties. For they, these functionaries, they deal directly with the people who are incompetent. And it's a nice translation. Mary Gregor translates it as incompetent. Kant used the words idioten. They're idiots, which is a technical term for mental incompetence, I suppose you could say. For they deal directly with the people who are idiots. This revision of the functionary's role represents a restriction of access to the public sphere. The businessman or technician of learning can no longer shed his civic persona and take on the public role of scholar. For scholars are now seen as a separate professional class with no direct contact with the uneducated public, comprising incorporated scholars, meaning university-trained university professors, or scholars at large, either amateurs or those working in academies and scientific societies, not teachers. This brings us to the titular conflict of the university faculties, which in the 18th century were still divided into the higher faculties of theology, law, and medicine, a remnant from the medieval university structure, theology, law, and medicine on the one hand, and on the other, the remaining lower faculties, including philosophy. Not among the higher faculties, philosophy nevertheless is clearly the greatest authority for Kant. Unlike the lofty triumvirate, philosophy is independent of any specific civic duty, unlike law, medicine, and theology, law, and medicine, which have a civic charge, training future preachers, etc. Unlike these, philosophy is independent of any specific civic duty, and therefore its legitimacy is not lodged in its pragmatic function, but resides purely and simply in reason and the pursuit of truth. Because reason entails the capacity, quote, to judge autonomously, that is, freely, according to the principles of thought in general, the function of philosophy is, and I still quote, to control the other faculties by adjudicating their disputes. Philosophy is thus the apex of a hierarchy that works something like this. The clergy, lawyers, and doctors perform their daily tasks in accordance with government regulations. They are forbidden to contradict openly their various dogmas in any way, lest they, quote, incite the people to rebel against the government, end quote. Within academia, these dogmas may be investigated, and the various controversies that arise within the higher faculties concerning what is taught or practiced among the people may be debated. So in the higher faculties, in the theological faculty, etc., it may be debated. That's the original distinction in a certain sense that Kant had, but now there's a third part. However, these disputes must be confined to the faculties within the university. I'm still doing this. For if, quote, if the businessmen of the faculties in their role of practitioners bring the conflict before the civil community, they drag it illegitimately before the judgment seat of the people, who are not competent to judge in scholarly matters, and it ceases to be a scholarly debate, end quote. Finally, if the conflict cannot be resolved within one or all of the higher faculties, then it must be presented before the court of reason, represented by philosophy. The strife occasioned by disagreement within the higher faculties becomes, metaphorically, a legal one. Quote, this conflict cannot and should not be settled by an amicable accommodation, but as a lawsuit calls for a verdict, that is, the decision of a judge, reason, which has the force of law, end quote. For instance, and this is one of Kant's examples, a biblical theologian believes in the divine revelation and the authority of scriptural teachings. The philosopher claims, actually knows, that, quote, religion does not differ in any point from morality. Its distinction from morality is merely a formal one, that reason, in its legislation, uses the idea of God, which is derived from morality itself, to give morality influence on man's will to fulfill all his duties. Therefore, end quote. Therefore, when the biblical theologian derives dogma from Scripture, philosophy has the right to intervene if such dogma distorts the true nature of religion. Quote, for the higher faculty, being concerned primarily for theoretical biblical knowledge, suspects the lower faculty of philosophizing away all the teachings that must be considered real revelation and so taken literally, and of ascribing to them whatever sense suits it. On the other hand, the lower faculty, looking more to the practical, that is, more to religion than to dogma, accuses the higher of so concentrating on the means, dogma, that it completely loses sight of the final end, inner religion, which must be moral and based on reason. And so, when conflict arises about the sense of a scriptural text, philosophy, that is the lower faculty, which has truth as its end, claims the prerogative of deciding its meaning, not theology. End quote. Philosophy appears as both the plaintiff and the judge in the court of reason. The plaintiff wins the case. And thus, with Kant, the Enlightenment leaves the court and coffeehouse to go to college. The university-trained and university-employed philosopher becomes the final arbiter of all things rational. In the name of universal publicity, the public sphere cloisters itself. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit of a recap and then move on to the final section. Kant's universal history has nature, both physical and human, as its agent. Personified, this main character propels the narrative action of his finely constructed novel, the composition of which even a wise creator might have been proud to claim as his own. The governing plot device, unsocial sociability, follows a common 18th century pattern. Private vices lead to public virtue. Perhaps the most common example of this motif is economic. Here, one talks of public welfare arising from a multitude of actions executed out of self-interest, or more bluntly, greed, a very popular conversation again in the United States. And laissez-faire liberalism is back on the rise. Kant's motor is more political. He assumes that the collective effects of private vices, violence, will one day become so intense and painful that the human race will allow itself to be coerced by law to live peacefully and harmoniously in well-governed republics. The German philosopher Odo Marquardt, relatively unknown, I think, in the Anglo-American world, Anglophone world, the philosopher Odo Marquardt has referred to this figure as the bonum durch malum Gedanke, the bonum through malum thought, in other words, good by way of evil, and attaches to it what he considers to be the dominant mode of doing philosophy in the 18th and early 19th centuries, theodicy. Leibniz, of course, initiated the form and invented the word by attempting to answer the question why a benign creator would allow so much evil in the world. Marquardt reads the posing and answering of this question in terms of a tribunal. Man puts God on trial, accusing him of capriciously and willfully allowing avoidable malignancies. The defense pleads innocence, either through claiming that the good balances out the bad, or, bonum durch malum, a higher good necessarily arises from unavoidable evil. During the course of the century, 18th century, and especially with the arrival of transcendental idealism, Marquardt asserts, God is exonerated, either because he is relegated with man to co-authorship of the moral world, or because he simply vanishes from the scene altogether. In his stead, man becomes the accused and is forced to sit in the defendant's seat. That is, with Kant's insistence on human autonomy, the human being assumes responsibility for the world and thus becomes both prosecutor, who is also judge and jury, and prosecuted. The apparent paradox of man being both prosecutor and prosecuted is easily resolved by the invention of Geschichtsphilosophie, the philosophy of history. Transcendental philosophy exonerated God by shifting responsibility to morally autonomous humans, beings who share the moral universe with God or simply displace him because they have the capacity to make the moral law and impose it on themselves. Combined with the assumption of infinite perfectibility, human autonomy becomes the absolute tribunalization, that's Marquardt's term, tribunalization of theodicy as universal history. Among humans, there are those who stand in the vanguard and those in the rear. To the extent that the intended realization of human perfectibility remains unfulfilled, to the extent that the engine of history wheezes and sputters, evil remains in the world. Since evil arises within the world as the result of human, not divine action or inaction, those responsible for the persistence of evil must be hunted down, tried, and if found guilty, convicted. Clearly, those in the vanguard, by virtue of their greater vision concerning the trajectory of universal history, are in position to apprehend, understand and seize, the culprits, those laggards who retard progress, whether intentionally as saboteurs or out of sheer indifference. We can give names to the vanguard, Robespierre, for instance, the Hegel who hears Napoleon pass through Jena in the night, the proletariat or their spokespersons, Lukács, Lenin, the vanguard party, the critics of ideology. The role of the prosecutor never remains unfulfilled. One may chafe at the sweeping inclusiveness of Marquard's use of the term theodicy. Similarly, one may found the tu quoque response readily slipping its moorings, for it seems that Marquard himself dons the prosecutor's garb. It may be fairer, however, to view Marquard as the defense attorney, for he seeks to relieve the burden placed on the individual's shoulders by denying infinite perfectibility. No offense has been committed because the prosecution willfully misrepresents history, making of it a weapon to be used against the lazy and cowardly, the fools and idioten, who stand accused of retarding progress. Marquard thereby stands in a line of post-war European intellectuals, usually considered conservative intellectuals, interestingly, who reject the tyranny of perfectibility by rejecting the philosophy of history that imposes it. Arnold Gehlen, who adopted Henri de Man's notion of post-histoire, Niklas Luhmann, who replaced teleology with contingency and history with evolution, and Jean-François Lyotard, who is considered, at least by Habermas, a conservative, who served the final rights over the meta-narratives of Bildung and emancipation. So my last section is a brief section on Lyotard. Young people in the room may never have known who he was, alas.
No.
He's completely fallen off the landscape. Anyway, is there another way of figuring the Kantian intellectual? Lyotard thought so. In the fickle world of contemporary theory, Lyotard has become largely ignored, relegated to obligatory citations and derision whenever the terms postmodern or meta-narratives arise. Yet, of the so-called French post-structuralists, Lyotard was the most vested in the work of Kant. All but ignoring Kant's practical philosophy and rejecting both the imperatives of the system and the philosophy of history, he was nevertheless concerned with reconstructing a plausible critique of political reason, based on reflective judgment and the notion of the sublime. Above all, he saw the philosopher's role to be the opposite to that of the judge. Rather than turning disputes into litigations, he wished, in the spirit of his age, to nullify verdicts, rekindle disagreement, and navigate the passages from one language game, or phrase as he called it, to another. The demise of the meta-narratives of knowledge and emancipation entails a critique of universal history and the modern forms of political legitimation. The question Lyotard asks is, quote, can we today continue to organize the mass of events coming from the human and non-human world by referring them to the idea of a universal history of humanity, end quote. The word continue in the question implies a tradition, modernity, in which a we, as the subject of history, has the capacity to affect and direct the course of progress. The answer Lyotard gives to this question is no. The emancipation of humanity from the shackles it has cast for itself has been a failure. It has even led to the universal exercise of terror. Lyotard uses that word. Modernity derives its legitimacy from narratives of emancipation that, quote, ground this legitimacy in a future to be brought about, that is, in an idea to realize. The idea, I'm still quoting, of freedom, enlightenment, socialism, general prosperity has legitimating value because it is universal. It gives modernity its characteristic mode, the project, that is, the will directed toward a goal, end quote. Terror is initiated when a particular instance, the French people 1789, say, or the proletariat 1917, these are Lyotard's examples, dons the mantle of the universal we. Acknowledging Hegel's, quote, dialectic of the particular and the universal, end quote, he writes, quote, for the ideal of absolute freedom, which is empty, any given reality must be suspected of being an obstacle to freedom. Thus, quote, terror acts on the suspicion that nothing is emancipated enough and makes it into a politics. Every particular reality is a plot against the pure universal will. The suppression of reality through the death of suspects satisfies a logic that sees reality as a plot against the idea. End quote. The self-selected guardians of the idea prevail by destroying the they. Lyotard then presupposes the collapse of universal history. Like Kant, indeed modeled on him, Lyotard claims a series of signs of history that corroborate the failure of the various narratives that legitimate the project of modernity. In part 2 of Conflict of the Faculties, Kant raises the question of human progress again and declares that, quote, there must be some experience in the human race which, as an event, points to the disposition and capacity of the human race to be the cause of its own advance towards the better, and toward the human race as being the author of this advance, end quote. Kant is revisiting his work from a decade earlier, asking that question again. The event itself, in this case the French Revolution, is not the cause of historical progress, but rather, quote, an intimation, a historical sign, end quote. This sign of history is perceived not by the actors of history or even by the observers of the actors, but by the observer of the observers. What the second-order observer sees is, quote, simply the mode of thinking of the spectators, which manifests such a universal yet disinterested sympathy for the players on the one side against those on the other, namely for the revolutionaries, that it demonstrates a moral character of humanity which not only permits people to hope for progress toward the better, but is already itself progress insofar as its capacity is sufficient for the present, end quote. Based on this sign, Kant feels empowered, quote, to claim to be able to predict to the human race its progress towards the better, for such a phenomenon in human history is not to be forgotten, because it has revealed a tendency and faculty in human nature, which nature and freedom alone, united in the human race in conformity with inner principles of right, could have promised, end quote. Kant sees confirmed in the reaction to the French Revolution what he has already presupposed, the inevitability of moral progress, which means the power of human freedom to co-determine the future. Last paragraph. No, sorry, not the last paragraph. Sorry for the false expectation, or false hope. Lyotard is drawn to the sign because of the form of reflective judgment it elicits and its affinity with the structure of the Kantian sublime. But he is not drawn to what Kant sees the signs say. Yet he cannot directly falsify Kant's claims for the same reason that Kant cannot directly prove his idea of moral progress. Rather, to be able to claim that there is no teleology of history, a presupposition, Lyotard also has to find signs and then read them correctly. And this is his abbreviation of what he does. He names a few. Auschwitz refutes the speculative doctrine, namely that all, and this is a quote, namely that all that is real is rational and all that is rational real. A clearly truncated interpretation of Hegel, but nonetheless, end quote. A series of events from Berlin 1953 to Berlin 1989 refutes historical materialism, quote, namely that all that is proletarian is communist and all that is communist is proletarian, end quote. May 1968 refutes liberal democratic discourse, quote, namely that all that concerns the political community can be said within the rules of the genre of representation, end quote. And a series of economic crises refutes the general prosperity promised by post-Keynesian economic liberalism, quote, namely that a harmonious regulation of needs and the means to satisfy them in work and in capital is possible and on the way to being achieved, end quote. What he makes these signs say is that we live not in an age of counterfactual optimism, but of an all too apparent disappointment. The temptation, of course, is to turn the refutation of the meta-narrative progress into a meta-narrative of decline and decadence, of which Lyotard is aware and which he tries to avoid. Quote, the issue here is the contingency of the linkage of this, to the situation that I have described as the failing of modernity. Politics always rests on the way one phrase, the present phrase, is linked to another phrase. From the different phrases that are actually possible, one will be actualized, and the actual question is, which one? The description of this failing does not give us any clue to the answer. End quote. What? to ask the classic question is to be done. Now the last paragraph. To be done, Lyotard tells us, is to respect these signs of 20th century history and not heal the wounds they open up. The true Kantian critical philosopher would therefore be not the one who tries to complete the project of modernity, but the one who recognizes the fission affecting the unity of the great discourses of modernity, end quote. Lyotard transforms the Kantian judge who magisterially presides over the court of reason into the critical philosopher who practices a kind of Kantian reflective judgment. And what the philosopher now reflects on cannot be the event of 1789, but the subsequent events that demolished the legitimacy of the modern narrative. This is what Lyotard calls postmodernity, not the movement past or beyond modernity, but the splintering and multiplication of the tales we tell ourselves. In effect, Lyotard tells us to focus our gaze not on the idea of the putatively manifest destiny of humanity, but on the fate of individual humans, not on the realization of a single purpose, but on the this is a quote, infinity of heterogeneous finalities, the opposite of Kant's admonition. At the very least, as we wait for nature to push us down a path that does not exist to a goal that is not there, my editorial, we, the same we that Kant spoke for, the academic intellectuals, squeeze not so much between ruler and ruled as between our fellow citizen and fellow citizen, should refrain from asking the question whether the human race as a whole is to be loved, and quit turning our backs on the imperfectible creatures standing next to us. Thank you.
Okay.